1996. In a backstage room at Madison Square Garden, 45-year-old Ace Frehley was staring at the contract in his hands. His signature, ink still wet, had just formalized one of the biggest heists in rock history. That night, as he walked onto stage, 18,000 fans celebrated the return of Space Ace. But Ace had to accept a new reality. The Kiss reunion tour would become one of the most lucrative rock tours in history, but he would only receive half of what the original members were getting. Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley's lawyers had stolen $15 million from Ace through a masterfully crafted contract trap, and that money would never be paid back. But the real story was the 14 years of revenge, regret, and manipulation that led to that signature. Because when Ace Frehley left Kiss in 1982, he believed the band would never recover. 14 years later, when he returned to that stage, he would learn that some deals are written to be lost from the start. The story began on a cold December day in 1982. Ace Frehley sat in the living room of his Connecticut home, reading a letter from Kiss management. The official language was cold and distant. Creative differences, musical direction divergences, mutual agreement. But Ace could read between the lines. Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley didn't want him. After 10 years together, building the world's biggest rock band, selling hundreds of millions of albums, Ace Frehley was history. As he put that letter down on the table, he thought the Space Ace makeup would never touch his face again. He was wrong. For 14 years, Ace Frehley tried to carve his own path. The Frehley's Comet project was initially promising. The first album released in 1987 went gold. The Rock Soldiers single entered MTV rotation. Ace was finally proving he was an artist independent of Kiss. But the music industry was ruthless. The second album failed. The third was even worse. By the mid-90s, Ace was alone in his Connecticut home, a man lost in the career labyrinth. His concerts were in small clubs, his albums released on independent labels. The man who once filled Madison Square Garden was now playing 300-capacity venues. And that's when the phone rang. A Tuesday in September 1995, 3 in the afternoon. The caller was a lawyer from Kiss management. "Mr. Frehley," the man said in a polite but distant voice, "Gene and Paul want to talk with you. We have something to discuss about a reunion." When Ace hung up that phone, he thought it was a mistake. After 13 years, they wanted him back? But as he would learn, some invitations aren't gifts, they're traps. Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley's consideration of a reunion in 1995 wasn't altruistic. Kiss had been hemorrhaging since the late 80s. The unmasked era had been coldly received by fans. New albums were failing. Concert venues were half empty. But MTV Unplugged changed everything. The acoustic concert aired in August 1995 included a surprise appearance by the original lineup, Ace and Criss. That night, when the 4 original members stood side by side on television screens, even in the pre-social media era, the news spread like lightning. Fans went crazy. Phone lines jammed. MTV announced record viewership numbers. And Gene Simmons, as always, saw the money. A reunion tour, if organized correctly, could generate hundreds of millions of dollars. But Gene and Paul had a problem. Ace Frehley and Criss. The 2 original members represented half of the band's identity and the fan nostalgia factor, but Gene and Paul didn't want to give them control. Kiss had been Simmons and Stanley's company since the 80s. They owned the trademark. They made the business decisions. Most of the money went to their accounts. A reunion threatened this power balance. The solution? Bring Ace and Peter back, but treat them not as real partners, but as paid employees. The first meeting took place in a luxury hotel in New York. Gene and Paul wore suits, accompanied by two lawyers. Ace came alone, in jeans and a leather jacket. "Let's do a reunion," Gene said, with that characteristic cold smile. "But first, we need to discuss the business details." A contract was placed on the table, 20 pages filled with fine print, complicated with legal jargon and subclauses. "25% of the tour revenue is yours," Paul said. "Merchandise, album sales, concert revenue, clean money." When Ace heard that number, he hesitated. 25% didn't sound fair. If there were 4 members, everyone should get 25%, right? "Gene and I are also getting 25%, Paul said, as if reading Ace's thoughts. "Peter gets 25% too. The remaining 25% goes to Kiss Corporation for expenses." Ace did the math. If 4 members were sharing equally, why was there also a corporate cut? But the lawyers explained: stage production, tour management, marketing, insurance, travel. "This is standard industry practice," they said. Ace didn't sign that contract. Not yet. He went home, thought about it. Frehley's Comet had dissolved. His last album hadn't sold. Mortgage payments were piling up. The Kiss reunion tour could save Ace's career. Just 20 concerts, maybe 30. A clean $1 million, maybe 2. Then he could return to his solo career, but this time strengthened by the Kiss nostalgia factor. It seemed logical, but what Ace didn't see were the traps buried in the fine print of that contract. And those traps would lead to the biggest mistake of his career. Ace Frehley signed that contract in February 1996. 3 clauses were buried in the legal language. 3 bombs he didn't notice when signing. First clause: original member status. The contract defined Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley as founding members, while classifying Ace and Peter as original performance lineup members. It seemed like a subtle distinction, but legally it meant Ace had no voting rights in band decisions. Gene and Paul could decide everything from tour details to merchandising deals. Ace could only approve. Second clause: revenue calculation formula. Ace's 25% share was calculated from net revenue, not gross. And the definition of expenses was incredibly broad. Stage design, lighting, pyrotechnics, tour bus rental, hotel accommodation, catering, per diem, insurance, legal fees, management fees, marketing costs. When the tour ended, 60% of gross revenue was shown as expenses. Ace's 25% share was 25% of what remained, not 25% of total gross. Third clause: merchandise control. Kiss's iconic logo and masks were Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley's trademarks. This meant revenue from every t-shirt, poster, mask, action figure sold during the tour went to them first. Ace's share only came from concert tickets and album sales. But merchandise was the biggest revenue source for rock tours. The reunion tour began in June 1996. Tiger Stadium in Detroit. 39,000 fans. Opening night was electric. The spotlights went down. Intro music started. 4 silhouettes walked onto stage. The makeup was back. Space Ace, Starchild, Demon, Catman. The crowd went insane. When Ace picked up that Les Paul, he heard 50,000 pairs screaming. In that moment, 14 years of exile were forgotten. This was homecoming. But as the tour continued, reality began to crystallize. On the tour bus, Gene and Paul sat in the front row, executive seats. Ace and Peter in the back. Hotel rooms were different. Gene and Paul stayed in presidential suites. Ace and Peter, standard rooms. "Budget cuts," said the tour manager. Backstage, Gene and Paul made every decision. Set list, encore songs, stage banter, meet and greet schedule. Ace and Peter weren't consulted, only informed. And then the first check arrived. The tour's first month had ended. 10 concerts, each one stadium-packed. Gross revenue exceeded $20 million. When Ace's check arrived, he opened the envelope. $300,000. His 25% share should have been $4.5 million. It was almost 15 times less. He immediately called the tour accountant. "Expenses," said the accountant in a cold voice. "Stage production $7 million, marketing $3 million, insurance $2 million, management fees $1.5 million, legal fees $800,000, tour bus rental $600,000, hotel accommodation $1 million, net revenue only $4 million. Your share is 25%, $1 million. After tax deductions, $300,000. When Ace hung up the phone, his hands were shaking. This was in the contract. It was buried in those fine print clauses, but he hadn't seen it before signing. Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley had deceived him. $15 million, the real share Ace was entitled to, had been stolen. And legally, Ace could do nothing. He had signed the contract. When Ace walked onto stage that night, 40,000 fans were screaming for Detroit Rock City. But Ace had only one thought in his head. This was why he left Kiss 14 years ago. And now, by coming back, he was making the same mistake again. The reunion tour lasted 9 months, from June 1996 to March 1997. 192 concerts, 3 continents, 3 million tickets. Gross revenue exceeded $200 million, one of the most lucrative rock tours to that date. Forbes magazine put Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley on the year's richest rock stars list. Both were estimated to have earned $40 million from the tour. Ace Frehley's earnings? $6 million, 3% of the gross. As an original Kiss member, Ace's share should have been at least $50 million. $44 million had been stolen. But Ace didn't speak up. Why? Because if he spoke, the tour could be canceled. Legal lawsuit, headlines, fan disappointment, and Ace didn't want that. For 14 years, Kiss fans had wanted him back, and he didn't want to disappoint them. Also, Gene and Paul's lawyers were very powerful. Winning a lawsuit would take years, cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. Ace didn't have that money. So he stayed silent. After the tour ended, Ace returned to his Connecticut home. $6 million was in his account, $4 million after taxes. It was good money, but 1/10 of what he deserved. Every time he looked at that money, he remembered the theft. He remembered Gene Simmons's cold smile. He remembered the meeting where Paul Stanley lied. "We're all getting 25%, Paul had said. But Gene and Paul had taken $40 million each from merchandise revenues, trademark licensing fees, corporate shares. Ace consulted with a lawyer, reviewed the contract, evaluated options. "You can file a lawsuit," said the lawyer, "but your chances of winning are low. You signed the contract. Every clause is legally binding. It may be manipulative, but it's not illegal." Ace talked with other lawyers too. They all said the same thing. The contract was ironclad. Gene and Paul's lawyers had closed every loophole. Ace was trapped. Years passed. Kiss did other tours. Farewell tour in 2000, another reunion in 2002, another farewell in 2004. Each time, Gene and Paul offered Ace the same contract, and each time, Ace accepted. Because he had no alternative. Solo career was stagnant. Fans wanted to see him with Kiss. He needed the money. So he came back. Again and again. Each time subjected to the same manipulation. Each time receiving 6 or 7 million. Gene and Paul taking 40 million each. In 2014, Ace finally left. This time forever. "I will never work with Kiss again," he said in an interview. "Gene and Paul deceived me. They stole $15 million, and I will never make that mistake again." At the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame ceremony in April 2014, Ace walked onto stage, gave his acceptance speech, then left. He didn't even shake Gene and Paul's hands. Fans noticed. Media noticed. There was a problem within Kiss, and Ace was no longer staying silent. But the final chapter of the story hadn't been written yet. Because in the 2020s, Ace Frehley would finally tell the truth, and that truth would rewrite rock music history. In 2018, Ace Frehley released the Spaceman album. One song was particularly striking, "Without You, I'm Nothing." It was clearly about Gene and Paul. The lyrics were merciless. "You took my money, you took my name, you played the game, but I'm not the same. Without me, you're nothing. You know it's true. I built your kingdom, but you never knew." Ace was finally speaking. But not just in his songs, in interviews too. On Eddie Trunk's radio show, Ace shared the details. "On the 1996 reunion tour, Gene and Paul told me 25% share," Ace said. "But in reality, I got 3%. Because they inflated expenses, hid merchandise revenues, manipulated trademark fees. They stole $15 million. And legally, you can't call it theft, because I signed the contract. But morally, this was the biggest betrayal I experienced in my entire career." Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley responded, but their defense was weak. "Ace misunderstood," Gene said. "Everything was in the contract. We didn't deceive anyone." Paul was harsher. "Ace is paranoid. We gave him a fair share. If he wanted more, he should have hired a better lawyer." But the rock community sided with Ace. Fans criticized Gene and Paul on social media. Music journalists wrote articles. Even other former Kiss members spoke up. Peter Criss admitted he experienced the same manipulation. Ace's story wasn't just about Kiss. It showed the dark side of the entire music industry. How many artists had lost millions due to unfair contracts? How many musicians couldn't receive revenues from music they created? Prince had fought for years about contract slavery. Taylor Swift had battled for ownership of her master recordings. Ace Frehley was another artist experiencing this systemic problem. But Ace's story was special. Because those who manipulated him were former bandmates. They had spent 10 years together, toured the world, accumulated memories backstage. And then, Gene and Paul saw Ace as a number on a business list. Friendship ended, only money remained. In 2023, Kiss went on their final tour. Under the name End of the Road World Tour, they vowed to say goodbye forever. Ace wasn't invited. Gene and Paul toured with the new lineup. Despite fans wanting Ace, the answer was clear. "Ace and Peter are part of history," Paul Stanley said, "but not our future." Ace's response was definitive. "Kiss is done for me. I'll let Gene and Paul count their money. I'm making music." And at that time, Ace was working on a new album called 10,000 Volts. It would be released in 2024 and would be Ace's latest project. He was 73 years old in the final chapter of his career. But he still played guitar every day, still was in the studio every day. The 15 million stolen from Kiss would never come back. But Ace's pride, talent, legacy were there, and nobody could take that. Because Ace Frehley finally understood, money is temporary, music is forever. Let Gene and Paul age with their millions. Ace would be immortalized with his guitar. Ace Frehley's story is one of rock music history's most bitter betrayal stories. $15 million, stolen years, lost friendship. But Ace never became a victim. He survived. He continued his solo career, released albums, did tours. Even without Kiss, Ace Frehley existed. The Space Ace mask had fallen long ago, but Paul Daniel Frehley was standing. In 2024, Ace gave an interview. "When I signed that contract in 1996, I made my biggest mistake," he said. "But I learned something from that mistake. Never trust anyone, always bring your lawyer, always read the fine print. Gene and Paul taught me that. It was an expensive lesson, but it was a necessary lesson." Ace's story is a warning for young musicians. Contracts are everything. Fine print is everything. Legal jargon is everything. One signature can end your career. Ace Frehley learned it the hard way. It cost $15 million. But now, by telling that story, he was protecting other artists from falling into the same trap. Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley are millionaires today. The Kiss franchise is worth hundreds of millions. Merchandise, licensing, film rights, documentaries. The empire is growing. But their legacy and history? Controversial. Fans see them as businessmen, not musicians. The betrayals of Ace and Peter weren't forgotten. And in the rock community, reputation is everything. Ace Frehley is leaving a different legacy. Loyal, talented, a real musician. During Kiss's golden age, Ace's guitar solos were the band's signature. The solos on the Alive album, the melodies on Destroyer, the riffs on Love Gun, they were all Ace's. Gene and Paul could write songs, but Ace gave them soul. And that soul would last forever, even if $15 million were stolen. Because in the end, music transcends everything: manipulation, theft, betrayal. Ace Frehley's guitar was stronger than all of them. The $15 million stolen from Kiss reunions never came back. Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley never apologized. No legal lawsuit was filed because the contract was legally valid. Was it manipulative? Absolutely. Was it immoral? Undeniably. But was it illegal? No. Ace's story is a cautionary tale in rock music history. It shows how unfair contracts can ruin a career. It shows how band dynamics can be betrayed. And most importantly, it shows the true face of people who value money more than friendship. Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley made Kiss an empire. But the ideological foundation of that empire was built on the stolen millions of Ace Frehley and Peter Criss. Ace Frehley's spirit still shines, and fans know the difference between a real musician and a businessman. Ace will always remain a musician. Gene and Paul will always be businessmen. In distant lands, Ace Frehley still plays his Les Paul. With trembling hands, heavy fingers, but he still plays. Every string on that guitar tells a story. The golden age of Kiss, betrayal, stolen money, survival. And that story will echo in rock history forever.